First on Ford, the horses are under some pretty big bonnets.
Asked a girl what she wanted to be. She said, baby, can't you see? I wanna be famous, a star on the screen, but you can do something in between. Baby, you can drive my car. Yes, I'm gonna be a star. Baby, you can drive my car, and baby, I love you.
Hello and welcome to our final programme from the Haynes Motor Museum here in Somerset. I'm with the patron of the museum, John Haynes, who's not quite as old as this car. This is an Oldsmobile Curved Dash runabout. This was built in America in 1903, and what's more, there's loads more American cars in here, most of which would cost an absolute fortune to run nowadays.
Seems she forgot all about the library like she told her old man now. And with the radio blasting goes cruising just as fast as she can now. And she'll have fun, fun, fun till her daddy takes the TV away. Fun, fun, fun till her daddy takes the TV away. Well, the girl's being standard cause she walks, looks and drives like an ace. You walk like an ace now, you walk like an ace. She makes the Indy 500 look like a Roman chariot race. You look like an ace now, you look like an ace. A lot of guys try to catch her, but she leads them on a wild goose chase. You drive like an ace now, you drive like an ace. She'll have fun, fun, fun till her daddy takes the TV away. Fun, fun, fun till
I dread to think how many gallons to the mile this lot does. By the way, the flashy pink number is a 1957 Dodge Coronet. Its proud owner is Rod Granger.
I think it epitomises the late 50s era of American car styling. The styling's outrageous. You either love it or you hate it, but you can't ignore it. But the thing to remember is that this car is not extraordinary. This was a family car. These cars have reputations of being gas guzzlers. I don't actually know what this does to the gallon, but I think it's around about 20, which is really not too bad. So if you take it on the motorway, it's as good as any modern car. It has a superb ride, excellent performance. It's very easy to drive with automatic transmission. There's plenty of space. It's very practical. It's got what they call the Red Ram V8. It's 325 cubic inches. That's 5,300 cc's. But it's a big, lazy engine. This is no sports car. It's got plenty of torque and quite a bit of get up and go if you hit the accelerator. Well, I bought it from a dealer in Miami, and the car's in extraordinary original condition. It's got a bit of wear and tear, particularly the interior, but it does seem very genuine and very solid, and there have been no bits added to it or taken away. It's just as it was in 1957. Yeah, the car's been repainted, but in exactly the original colours. These two-tone pastel shades were very popular in the 50s. There were pinks and light blues, primrose yellows. Again, by today's standards, outrageous, but by the standards of the time, they were everyday car colours. It's definitely a head-turner. You can't go anywhere unnoticed. But I find that people, particularly over here, enjoy the car. They always stop and usually their mouths drop open and their eyeballs pop. And the kids in particular love it. It's terrific. They think it's wonderful. Well, I must admit, because I had a loose idea of buying a car before I went to the States, I had some idea of what I had to do, but in reality it was remarkably easy. I just had to find a shipping agent in Miami. It's just a question of looking in yellow pages, and it was all done in the morning. It's really a big boy's toy.
Well, I think the American collection is very important because American cars led the way as far as mass production was concerned. And of course, just as important as Europe are cars from America, because they both introduced them at round about the same time. And Henry Ford, after all, was first with the Model T, for mass production. And quite a lot of the collection are American cars for that very reason. And we start with a 1903 Oldsmobile Curved Dash runabout, single cylinder, 1.5 litre, lovely little car to drive, flat out at 20 miles an hour, but very high clearance. So for its day, muddy American roads were no problem for it. And then, well, we go through all sorts of things like the Model T and on to cars of the 30s. And again, in the late 30s, perhaps the Americans were making just about the best cars in the world. That's probably quite a controversial statement to make, but most of them had independent front suspension, hydraulic brakes, synchromesh gearboxes, were extremely comfortable, very well built, handled reasonably. Obviously, with the width of their roads, they've always been a little bit softly sprung, but that gives you good comfort. But then the trouble is that I'm afraid they didn't change that concept for the next some 30, 40 years, and they continued to have live rear axles, independent front suspension, but they didn't go to the more innovations that European manufacturers went to until the Suez Crisis in 1973, and then they started to downsize. The 39 Packard, I think it is, yes, 39 Packard. Yes, that's a favourite for the reasons I've already said. It's very pleasant to drive, to go touring in, if you like. And then another one is a 1966 Mustang. This is a Mustang convertible with a 289 cubic inch V8 engine, automatic transmission, disc brakes, and it has the original pony seats in. You'll notice that the seats have little embossed Mustangs, so they're called pony seats. And they're quite rare because, of course, most of them by now have deteriorated to the condition where they can't be used, and I don't think anyone is making reproductions either. So that's a nice feature of that car. And again, it's something I own personally in America when we first started out there, and it was second-hand, of course, when I bought it in 1976, and sold it to a friend, and bought it back about 10 years later, and here it is in the museum. Oh yes, well, the Corvette is the one and only American sports car. Okay, things like Cunningham's were made in very limited quantities, but the only mass production sports car from America is the Chevrolet Corvette. And the latest edition is a very, very efficient sports car. It is extremely exciting to drive, and it's a bit big, of course, for English roads, but the handling is excellent, good and flat. Way back in, I think it must have been 1985, we bought the current version of the Corvette, a brand new one, to use as the basis for one of our car manuals, and we took it right apart, put it together again like we always do, taking hundreds and hundreds of photographs of all the different processes. And we took a photograph of it when it was all down in pieces, and of course we have that photograph here. And that very car is the car, again, we now have in the museum.
From one extreme to another, a 1961 Messerschmitt KR200 or bubble car. The popular myth that they were made out of surplus ME-109 cockpits from the Second World War is, of course, totally untrue. They were actually the brainchild of Fritz Fend, an aeronautical engineer with the Luftwaffe. This one belongs to Mike Leeson from Wootton Bassett near Swindon. Mike, can you tell me about the history of the Messerschmitt?
Well, the Messerschmitt come about towards the end of the Second World War. It started off as an invalid carriage, a wooden invalid carriage, designed by a Luftwaffe engineer called Fritz Fend, who is still alive and living in Germany. His idea was to make a small vehicle capable of being self-propelled for injured servicemen. His idea was to make a three-wheeled wooden tricycle that would be propelled forward and backwards by pulling on a control column, rather like the one in here, to make the vehicle go forwards or backwards. Eventually, over a period of from the late 40s to the early 50s, he improved the car and eventually put an engine in it, but only a very tiny engine of 98cc, and eventually the engine was increased in size to from 150cc up to 175cc, and the car eventually become something like this, with a perspex roof, a control column, with a throttle on the handlebars, and 4 gears to propel the car forwards. In the 60s, the Mini was built, and the Mini was probably only about £20–30 more than the actual Messerschmitts, so that was one reason why they disappeared. The other reason is the actual factory where they were produced in Regensburg, Germany, had a serious fire and they stopped production.
The museum also boasts a fine collection of old motorbikes with magical names like Rudge, BSA, Velocette, Norton, Brough Superior. It's a real Aladdin's cave for the two-wheeled enthusiast. And just like the cars here, they're all maintained in full working order. Riding this Velocette is motorbike enthusiast and author Jeff Clume. He's responsible for the Haynes motorbike manuals.
I started up the motorcycle manuals. I had the task of writing the first 10 in 10 months, which is something I wouldn't like to do again, but it had to be done. And I ended up really in writing 19 of them, I think, in all. Well, it's a very good collection in the sense that it cuts right across the board, and it has some very interesting bikes amongst it. Well, I've picked 4 to represent various eras of motorcycling. So I've picked a 1915 Indian to represent the veteran era. I've picked a bike from the vintage era. I've picked one from the pre-war era and one from the post-war era, which seem to be a fair way of looking at them. Well, the 1915 Indian, I think, is possibly one of the most attractive bikes in the museum here. It's an American machine made in Springfield, Massachusetts. Just before the Great War, British bikes in general used belt drive, which had its problems because it slipped like fury in the wet, whereas the Indian had all-chain drive, and it was really a very advanced machine. It's difficult in a way to compare it with British machines because the demands of the American market were a little bit different. People had to travel long distances, so you had a large capacity V-twin engine which would sort of slog its way along. You had a foot clutch instead of a hand-operated clutch. And a very curious thing on the Indian is that it has a left-hand twist grip. Now, the reason for this is because the Indian was used by the police, and it was reckoned that if the police rode an Indian, he could suddenly draw his revolver and fire it with his right hand. And it was also said that by having the twist grip on the left, you could also stop runaway horses with your right. But I wouldn't think that was very practical because the bike surely would have scared the horse even more. The next one is this machine here, which is a 1930 KTT Velocette. Now, this was the first really serious attempt by a manufacturer to offer an over-the-counter racer. Velocettes had an enormous amount of success because they were the originators of really the first practical overhead camshaft engine. This, as you will see, is a very advanced design for 1930. It has its camshaft driven by bevels. The machines were of necessity rather expensive to put together because it meant hand assembly, but they won the TT in 1926 by as much as 10 minutes, if you can believe that. It was that far advanced. And in 29 they brought out the KTT, which was the, as I say, over-the-counter replica. This particular machine has had a long association with Brooklands, and as far as I've been able to trace, it was nearly always in the first 3 in the races it took part in. Uncharacteristically for a racing bike, it was raced continuously right to 1951. The next bike is a 1938 350 OK Supreme, and I've picked that because people are very enamoured with the glamour makes, the Nortons, the Velocettes and what have you, but there are a lot of smaller manufacturers in the Birmingham area who produce quite good machines for a moderate sort of price. But the OK Supreme bought in most of its parts. They probably made the frame and 1 or 2 other odds and ends. The engine was a Jap engine, and that's no relationship, of course, with the Orient at all. Jap engines were made by J.A. Prestwich and Company in Tottenham, North London, and they were very, very good engines. So if you bought a Jap engine, you bought it at a sort of a moderate price, and you knew you had the basis of a good machine there. The OK Supreme, the thing I like about the machine in the museum in particular is it's the silver cloud model, and the transfer on the tank is really beautiful. There's this motive with all of the clouds behind it, and in fact the rider has even gone to the trouble to put the similar transfer on his crash helmet, which I think looks very effective. Yes, the final bike is the BSA Gold Star. I've picked that because BSA was the cornerstone of the British motorcycle industry, and when BSA folded up in the early 70s, then the whole British industry fell apart. In fact, it's questionable really whether BSA should have been allowed to collapse. Anyway, BSA has brought out the Gold Star in 1939, which was really to give them a more sporting image, because most people thought of the BSA as a road-to-work bike and what have you. And the Gold Star, right from the word go, was extremely successful in the Clubman's TT races. So much so, in effect, that eventually they dominated them to such an extent that they stopped the Clubman's TT altogether. The one in the museum is an early example, a so-called ZB model. It is in sort of semi-touring trim, not in race trim, because bear in mind that if you rode in a Clubman's race, you had to have all of the road-going equipment on it, so you'll find it has lights and so on. But it's a most desirable machine and very much sought after today.
Another desirable machine is the MGPA sports car. Janice Redwood explains her family's special connection with it.
The car originally belonged to a man called Wallace Birtwistle, who lived next door to my husband's family. Ian spent most of his spare time working on the car and driving the car. But when Wallace decided he was getting a little old to drive the car, he offered it to Ian, and he said Ian could have half of it for a 21st birthday present, but pay him the other half, along with quite a few spare parts as well. And depending on where he was, or where the Air Force decided to send him, depended on how much time he could spend on the car. So eventually he went back to the University Air Squadron as an instructor. But he was killed in a flying accident in 1985, and after that I wasn't quite sure what to do with the car, because Ian had spent so much time and attention on the car that when the option came to put it in the museum, I was only too delighted, because it was being well looked after. Well, Amy one day will learn to drive it, and it will be her car, and I think her father would be very proud if she learned to drive it. I wanted to learn how the car works, obviously, and to be able to maintain it herself when it's hers.
When I pass my driving test, I will, at least.
John's taking us out for a spin in one of the classics of his collection, a 1929 Bentley. It really is the most exhilarating ride, but what's it like to drive, John?
Once you're moving, it's grand.
Yeah.
Manoeuvring, it's really hard work, but you have to continually adjust the controls, because the mixture, you have to adjust. The advance and retard on the ignition, you have to adjust. Modern cars, of course, have completely automatic advance and retards, but these old vintage cars, it all has to be done by hand.
So you can't just set it and then leave it, you've got to be adjusting all the time?
That's right. Now at the moment we're running on a smooth piece of road, so there's no need to touch it.
Right.
But when I come to a hill, I will have to retard the ignition slightly and perhaps enrich it slightly.
This must be a very heavy car. What sort of weight would it be?
I think it weighs about 10.5.
10.5, right.
They were very fast cars. These cars won at Le Mans in the 1920s. They won about 3 times.
It says we're going 40 there. It feels more like 70 to me.
Well, it is an old lady, and I am treating her with a lot of respect.
Right.
But it's very optimistically marked up to 150, which is a marvellous marketing ploy.
Yes. Seriously, what would this do if you wanted it to, with that size engine? Would it do a ton?
I would think it might just about manage
just about,
100
yes.
miles now.
So that occasional popping and banging is the fuel mixture not being quite right.
Well, we're going downhill now, so I'm again having to change it slightly.
Right. Did they sell well at the time in the 30s, these Tourers?
It was a luxury car.
Yeah.
And most unfortunately, in 1933, the company went into liquidation.
Yeah.
Because, of course, it followed the Great Crash, the Great Wall Street crash in 1929. But this is your traditional British sports car. Nothing could be more English than this.
Absolutely. Take this as a compliment, but you have a boyish enthusiasm for your cars. Would you say that's a fair description?
Yes, that's all right. They give me a lot of pleasure, and I hope they'll bring a lot of pleasure to many thousands of other people who visit the museum.
You see, a lot of people with classic cars, they wrap them in cotton wool and they take them to car competitions on transporters and never actually drive them. What do you feel about that?
Well, I think that's all wrong. If you're going to a concours with a classic car or a vintage car, you ought to drive the car there and then clean it when you get there. To have got it pristine beforehand and take it there in a transporter, well, we take points off when we judge concours events for that sort of thing.
In a nutshell, what would you say the qualities of the Bentley are?
Durability, speed, and everything that's best about British engineering and workmanship.
Right. From one superb competition car to another, a rare 1936 Delahaye Sports, which is being put through its paces by former racing driver Rob Walker. He owns the car and he raced with it at Le Mans in 1939. You enjoyed that, didn't you?
Very much indeed.
She sounds to be going very sweetly.
Oh, she's going absolutely marvellously. I haven't heard her go so well for years.
Must have brought back very happy memories of Le Mans for you.
Oh, terrific, yes. Well, I started, being an amateur, I started wearing a dark blue pinstripe suit on top. I had ordinary blue trousers that could get oily, but I thought I'd better be properly dressed for the evening, and so I had a pinstripe suit, and one of the journalists who was driving behind me said, I can just see the white stripe in Rob Walker's dark blue suit going down the straight at 120 miles an hour. Well, when dawn came, we had a gasket go, and my co-driver had burnt his foot rather badly and couldn't go on. I was wearing rope-soled shoes, and what I did was to jump into a bucket of water every time I came in, and this kept me cool enough. I had to do about 12 hours on end, of course coming in for pit stops, and by that time I think I'd just done about 10 hours on end, and my pit thought that I better come in and have a glass of champagne, because they'd all been drinking champagne solidly the whole time, and there was only about one bottle left. So they called me into the pit, and I had a glass of champagne, and I don't think I lost any places in doing it, and got back into the car much revived.
Well, that's it from me, and I hope you've enjoyed our visit to the Haynes Motor Museum. I must say a big thank you to John for being such a genial host. And I know, John, that you're a firm believer that the cars must be used.
Absolutely so. If they're static, they deteriorate, so they must be run.
Thanks again anyway. Well, I've had a great time, and although this isn't the most exotic car in the collection, it's a personal favourite of mine and brings back very happy memories of driving a TR4. So hold on to your hat. Bye-bye.
Trailer for sale or rent, rooms to let 50 cents. No phone, no pool, no pets. Ain't got no cigarettes. But 2 hours of pushing broom buys a 8 by 12 4-bedroom. I'm a man of means by no means. king of the road.